I made these patterned boxes out of scrap wood. A fellow YouTuber asked if I would make a box for the Beads of Courage charity. I watched a video about it and just couldn't say no. So there's some info about it down below if you're interested in making your own boxes. So these were just an experiment in creating patterns with my scraps. So let's get into it. Alright, so I raided my scrap pile to find any pieces that were usable for these boxes, then began milling the pieces so they were all the same thickness. And this is why I never throw anything away. I was able to get a decent amount of wood from these mistakes that were sitting around my shop for years. So I didn't know how long these pieces have been lying around in my shop, so I jointed one edge before cutting them to final width using my tapering jig, and then made sure to mark the square edge. Then I measured the width of all the pieces and set my fence to that narrowest of all the scraps and cut them to final width, making sure the jointed edge was against the fence. I'm so happy I finally got around to using these scraps that have been lying around. It makes my hoarding feel a little bit less crazy. So all the pieces are now the same width and thickness. I just needed to square up all the ends and they are ready for glue up. I told my kids the reason why I was making these boxes and they really wanted to help out. Of course, they wanted to paint rainbows all over them, but they settled for helping me create the random pattern. So these patterns were totally an experiment, so heading into this, I really had no idea what patterns I wanted to make. All I knew was that I wanted to cut the first glue up at a 45-degree angle, so I used a speed square to mark a 45-degree angle with a pencil so I could line it up when I glue it. Now, I could easily clamp the rows to each other widthwise, but it would be difficult to clamp the pieces lengthwise. So I used wood glue with a few dabs of CA glue on the ends to act as a temporary clamp, and this seemed to hold the ends together pretty well. I just had to hold the pieces together against a straight edge that was covered in packing tape to ensure the pieces were even with each other, and then I could move on to adding on the rows to create the blank. To create the first couple of rows, I clamped them to that tape-covered straight edge to make sure my glue up wasn't wonky. Typically, I would use clamps from the underside and from the top to create even pressure, but this was just a bit difficult with the smaller scraps that I had in there, so using a flat piece of MDF covered in wax paper helped to keep this glue up flat-ish. This was a slow process because I had to go row by row. I just waited 30 minutes or so between each row until I got a flattish blank and then turned it into a flat blank by sending it through the planer. I just put a ton of effort into making that blank. Now it's time to cut it up. So I set my miter gauge to 45 degrees and made the initial cut to clean up one end. In order to cut the rest of the blank into even strips, I placed a stop block on my sled temporarily with double-sided tape. I figured I wanted these strips to be as wide as each row was. So let's say all my scraps were made up that blank were 1.5 inches wide. So I set that stop block to cut strips that were 1.5 inches wide as well. I really had no idea what sort of pattern I was going to make with these, but when I flipped over every other piece and it created the chevron pattern, I knew that's what I wanted for box number 1. We'll get to box number 2 in a bit. Since this glue up is all end grain, I flooded it with glue. I also let the glue sit there for a bit before flipping the pieces over and clamping them up. My hope was that by waiting, the glue seeps into the end grain a bit before flipping the pieces, and I tested the strength of these pieces after they would not break. So after the glue dried, I cut off the pointy sides at the table saw and then sent the board through the planer to level it out. I was nervous about sending this through the planer, but look how nice and shiny that looks. So the required dimensions for these Beads of Courage boxes are 4 by 6 by 4 inches tall. So I ripped a piece of the blank for the sides so that the box would be 4 inches tall on the inside. Then I ripped a scrap piece of walnut that will be the border for the box, and I glued it to the strip that I just cut out. After I cleaned up that glue up, I decided to cut the grooves for the top and bottom of the box before cutting all the sides to size. This will ensure all the grooves are even with each other, and I totally forgot to do this on the second box, you'll see. So I'm using plywood for the box bottom, so I just kept taking small passes until the plywood fit into the groove. I should have used my kerf maker, something I actually remembered to do on the second box. For this box, I decided to cut the top of the box first and then cut all the sides to length based on the dimensions of the top. This top is going to sit in a groove in the side, so I used a rabbiting bit to create a rabbet around all the edges of the top that was about half the thickness of the material. I did this in a few shallow passes and used a backer board to avoid tear out. Again, before cutting all the sides to size, I wanted to make the groove for the top, so I set the blade height so that it was slightly higher than the width of the rabbet. and set the fence so it was the same as the depth of the rabbit. Just to make sure I was setting everything correctly, I ran a scrap piece through and checked that it's exactly what I was looking for. The lip left over from that cut is exactly the same size as the depth of the rabbit I cut. So when I finish making the groove in the table saw to fit the lip of the rabbit, the top will be completely flush with the sides of the box. You'll see what I'm talking about in a second. So everything was set correctly on the table saw, so I ran the board through the table saw one time. And because I had that scrap that I tested on, I could use it to dial in the fit of the groove by taking multiple passes until the rabbit fit into the groove. Now that I know that the fence was in the correct position for the correct width of the groove, I just had to pass the panel through the table saw a second time and then make one last final pass to clean up the middle. Now the top of the box fits perfectly into that groove and its top is flush with the top of the sides. Awesome. So finally time to cut the sides of the box to size. I'm going with a simple clean miter joint, so I set my blade to 45 and whipped out my crosscut sled. I made the initial 45-degree cut on one end, making sure the angle of the cut was oriented so that the grooves I just cut were on the inside of the box. I mentioned earlier I cut the sides of this box based on the dimensions of the top. To do this, I placed the box top into the groove and lined the corner up with the inside of the miter, then made a mark by the other corner of the box. While this method was easy to do, I didn't really think about how it was going to mess up the pattern on the outside, something I fixed on the second box. Anyway, I flipped the board over to make the second cut for the side, and one side of the box is officially cut. Since I didn't cut these on the glue joint, I wanted the pattern to flow around the box, so I flipped the panel over again to cut the miter for the adjacent side. I lined the panel up with the kerf on the sled and then made the cut, creating this little triangle piece. Then, repeating the same process as before to get the correct width of the side, I placed the top into the groove, marked for my next cut, lined it up on the sled, and cut away. Again, trying to preserve that flowing grain effect, I flipped the panel over and cut away that little triangle in preparation for cutting the next piece. Since the sides of the box that are opposite each other are the same size, I could just use my stop block to cut them instead of marking and measuring. I lined up the already cut piece next to the kerf line on the sled and locked the stop block into place, made some micro adjustments so that it would be the perfect width, and then made the cut for the matching side, and repeated the same thing for the last side of the box. Before moving forward on that box, let's get started on box number 2. I had so much fun experimenting with that pattern, I decided to do another experiment. This time I glued up longer strips of scraps into 2 panels that were glued in different patterns. Then I repeated the same process as the first box, cut those panels into strips at a 45-degree angle using a stop block that was set to the same width as the strips of wood. Then I lost the footage, but I glued those strips back together in a random pattern and tried my best to keep everything aligned. This time I used a circular saw with a fence to cut off the pointy edges and then squared up the opposite side of the table saw. This yielded better results. I really had no idea where this pattern was going to take me on this, but I realized if I cut this panel into strips right at the pointy tips of those diamond shapes, it created this cool random triangle pattern. Then there was this little strip in between those tips of triangles that I needed to cut away in order to keep creating that cool triangle pattern. So I just kept lining up the blade with the corners of the triangles until I cut the whole board up. Then I messed around with figuring out how I wanted to glue it up and landed on this. 2 strips of the triangles flipped end to end with a walnut border like the first box. And a random triangle zigzag sort of pattern for the box top. So this time instead of cutting the sides to fit the top, I cut the sides so the corners of the box would be on a seam. Then I cut the top to fit afterwards. So I cut all the sides roughly to the correct width. This will be perfected in the next step. Then I set my blade to 45 degrees, then lined up the pieces with the kerf on the sled and cut the miters on both sides of one piece. Then I took the opposite side of the box that needs to be the same width as that first piece and cut one miter on one end. To make sure these 2 pieces are exactly the same width, I once again used my stop block. I lined up the first piece with the kerf on the sled, locked the stop block into place, and then cut the miter on the matching second piece. These are now the same width, and I did the same thing for the other 2 pieces of the box. Alright, moving on, I totally forgot to make the grooves on these side pieces before cutting them up, but I did remember to use my kerf maker this time, which made the process for getting the correct width a bit easier. I made one pass about a 1/4 inch up from the bottom of all the pieces, and then flipped my kerf maker over to adjust the fence and made a second pass on all the pieces to make a perfect fitting groove for the plywood bottom. To cut the plywood to size, I placed it so that one end is lined up with the end of the groove and marked it on the other end of the groove, but I cut it slightly shy of that line to leave some room for glue. I did the same thing for the other box as well. Now to figure out the dimensions for the top of the box. I temporarily held the pieces together with the rubber band and marked about half the thickness of the material on all the sides. Then measured the distance between those marks and wrote it down on my bench. That's how big the top needs to be because of the grooves that it's going to sit in. I wanted to make sure the top was symmetrical, so I took those measurements I jotted down, divided them in half, and used a center finding ruler lined up on a seam to mark out the edges. Then I cut the top on those lines at the crosscut sled and then took it over to the router table to create the rabbet just like the first box. And just like the first box, I made the grooves in the sides of all the pieces to hold the top. At this point, I still thought this would be a regular lidded box, not a sliding lid, so the process was the same. Since I'm just using miters for the joinery on these boxes, they need some sort of reinforcement. I considered gluing in splines after the glue up, but I thought it would be too busy with the chaotic pattern already going on, so I went with a hidden spline in the miters. This is the same process as the hidden spline for the waterfall side table I recently built, so if you're interested in seeing how I made this jig and how to set it up, check out that video. Basically, the jig holds your workpiece at a 45, you clamp stop blocks where you want to start and stop the groove, clamp the workpiece to the jig, lower the jig over the straight bit, run it along until you get to the stop block, and boom, you have a groove for a hidden spline, or a floating tenon, if you will. So next you just need to measure how wide the splines need to be and cut them to width. I already had this oak milled to the correct thickness for these grooves from my waterfall side table that I built, but you want to just make sure that the grain is running up and down on these splines for them to be strong. I rounded off all the corners to compensate for the router bit and then cut them to length at my crosscut sled. And that moment when it all clicks into place like this is just so satisfying. So this is when I decided to make this second box have a sliding lid instead of a regular lid. So I needed to cut off that top section. I wanted to leave the smallest curve as possible in the cut, so that means I needed to use my bandsaw. I cut as straight as I possibly could, and then the pieces just needed a bit of sanding on a flat surface to smooth them out, and then I sanded all the insides of the boxes before assembly. Alright, deep breath before the glue up. I put glue in all the grooves in the bottom and in the slots in the sides, and I did not put glue in the top groove since this is the box with the sliding top. And besides for adding strength to the miters, the splines really help with alignment of the glue up. These pieces just snap together and it made this whole glue up very easy. I used a corner clamp around the middle section of the box, and because there's no lid on this glue up, it was really easy to clean up all the glue squeeze out, and then I just put clamps going from every direction to close up those miters. The next box has a regular fitted lid, so the lid gets glued into place during assembly and the inside gets completely closed up. So I lined the inside with tape to help with cleaning it out from the squeeze out once I cut it open. But I'm a really messy gluer, and I think I should start getting into the habit of pre-finishing with shellac instead. Moving on to the lids. The sliding lid is easy to do. Just glue the piece that was cut off at the bandsaw onto the edge of the lid and clamp it into place. I could have cut a new piece or glued in a filler to completely eliminate the gap, but I don't want this box to be a puzzle. Back to box number 1, the edges of the reveal were a bit jagged, so I decided to add a small inlay. I used a 1/16 inch bit in my palm router and used the fence for the router to make sure the lines were straight and at the correct distance. Then just went around the box on all the sides, creating a tiny little groove between the inside pattern and the walnut border. To fill in those little grooves, I used my thin ripping jig set to the same thickness as the grooves and then ripped thin strips of contrasting wood. Then I took a chisel and roughly cut a 45-degree end on one side. Then I whipped out my new shooting board and put the miter attachment on and then used my hand plane to actually make that cut 45 degrees. Love it. I lined the inlay piece in the groove to mark out for the next cut, rough cut it with the chisel again, cleaned it up on the shooting board, and it fit perfectly into place. I repeated the same thing for all 4 sides, and then I put CA glue in the grooves and tapped the inlay pieces into place. Once dry, I cut away the excess with a flush cut saw, then my battery died, but after that I cleaned up the rest with a block plane and sanded everything smooth. Love that contrast now. Time to cut off the lid. I set the blade height so it was just barely the thickness of the sides for a safer cut, and then I set the fence so the blade will cut the lid right where the walnut meets the pattern. I've only done this twice before, so I was a bit nervous I would mess it up. Fingers crossed. I made the first cut and realized the splitters on my zero clearance insert were in the way. Oops, so I swapped out the throw plate and made the rest of the cuts. Now the lid just needs to be separated with the handsaw, which was pretty quick to do, and the two pieces just need a little cleanup work. I used a block plane to clean it up, and then after that little lip was planed off, I just took both parts to a flat surface to finish sanding them so that they were completely flat. Now, in order for this lid to be a pressure fit lid on the box, there needs to be an inner layer of wood. So I took some maple and cut a miter on one edge, and then I lined it up with the box to cut the second miter, and it didn't fit right away, so I used the donkey's ear attachment on my shooting board to shave off a little bit with my hand plane until I got a perfect fit. I repeated the same thing for all the sides for the inner lining, and then I glued them into place. After sanding, the last thing to do was to add a handle on the lid. I cut a small scrap of walnut, rounded over all the edges, marked out the center of the lid, and then glued it into place. Since these boxes will be going to kids who are sick, they recommend natural finishes, so I went with walrus oil cutting board oil, which is an all-natural, food-safe finish. This part was so exciting. Getting to see those patterns come to life was so satisfying. As I was experimenting with all these patterns, new ideas kept popping into my head, and I just wanted to experiment with making more of these patterns. I had a ton of scrap left over from making these and decided to turn some of it into this cutting board. So I still have some more scraps, so there might be more of these that I will make. All right, I cannot be more pleased with how these turned out. I mean, I had no idea what they were going to look like when I first started. I just glued up some scraps, cut them up, glued them up again, and just figured it out as I went along, and so happy. Definitely want to experiment more with patterns like this. So some notes. So I mentioned that I built the sides to around the top of this one. So that means that I was cutting it on like while the pattern is still moving and not on a seam. I tried to keep it like flowing around, but I really don't love the way that looks. It looks really great on the top where the walnut is wrapping around, but I don't think it looks so great over here. So with the second box, I cut it on the seams and the grain is wrapping around a little bit better, and I definitely like this way better. I was just so focused on getting the dimensions correct for the Beads of Courage boxes that it was 4 by 6 by 4. I just had that number in my head and I wasn't thinking about the pattern. So with this one, I wasn't thinking about the numbers, I was just thinking about the pattern, but I think this one is just too small for Beads of Courage. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to send it in. It might be too small for them. I'm gonna reach out to them and find out. So for the sliding lid, there is a gap over here that's left over from the bandsaw. It's a very small little gap, and I left it there because I don't want this box to be a puzzle. Kids need to know which side to open. I don't want them yanking on this side, so that's why I left it there. But if you wanted to create a box like this where you want to create mystery or a secret as to where you want to open the box, you can either fill in the gap, you could glue on like a thin little piece on the underside, or you could just cut a new piece and then glue that on. But then you might not have the grain flowing on the top. So different options and different ways that you could create a more seamless look. I'm going to keep the gap there. As far as the colors go, I'm just loving all these colors here. So like this gray is poplar, this also is poplar, walnut, canary wood, maple, the green is poplar. I forgot what this red one is. Goncalo Alves, I think it's called. Maybe I'm saying that wrong. But yeah, I just love the variations of colors on this one. I'm just so pleased with how that turned out. Now on this one, this inlay was a last minute decision, and I think that it is actually my favorite part about this box. That contrast, that it goes from the walnut to the pattern, I just think that that's so, it looks like really professional looking. So that's just what I really love about this one. Very, very pleased with how that turned out, and the lid is coming off great and it goes on really great. Very, very pleased with how this turned out as well. So while I was making these, I was a little bit concerned that these were end grain joints. So every time after I did a glue up, I would test the cutoffs and I would try to break it, and it would not break. Even the super thin pieces would break at the wood and not at the glue joint. I wouldn't do this on furniture, but I think for this application it's totally fine. So last night I actually dropped the cutting board that I made with the scraps and the corner broke off. and it did not break off at the glue seams, it broke off with the wood grain. I could just glue this back together, but it just shows me that those joints were fine, and I think that these are good to go. So I also had this one extra scrap from that panel from the first box. I'm probably going to turn this into a cutting board as well, or I really don't know, maybe coasters. That would be a good idea. So this was just a really fun experiment, and I cannot wait to experiment more with these patterns or different patterns and all the different tones of wood. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you on the next project.